Hello and welcome to China Forum, the leading program for discussing the latest in trends and developments in Chinese culture, politics, economics, and society. Today we will be discussing the phrase, new model of great power relations, which is commonly used to describe the U.S.-China relationship. We are happy to welcome our expert today, Mr. Robert Daly. Mr. Robert Daly is the director of the Kissinger Institute on China in the United States at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Before joining the Wilson Center, Mr. Daly was director of the Maryland China Initiative at the University of Maryland. From 2001 to 2007, he served as the American director of the Johns Hopkins University Nanjing University Center for Chinese and American Studies in Nanjing, China. He began his work in U.S.-China relations as a diplomat with the United States Information Agency from 1989 to 1991, as well as teaching Chinese at Cornell University. From 1992 to 99, Mr. Daly worked on television projects in China as a host, actor, and writer. And during this time, he helped to produce a Chinese language version of Sesame Street and other children's television workshop programs. Mr. Daly is also a regular commentator on current affairs for the Chinese service of Voice of America. Mr. Daly, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So, during his trip to Washington, D.C. in February 2012, then Vice President Xi Jinping kind of initiated for a new type of relationships between major countries in the 21st century. And since this time, this phrase has become somewhat of a buzz phrase almost to describe the U.S.-China relations. So to begin our conversation today, can you provide us with a little background or personal insight into the origins of the phrase great power relations?
Right. As you mentioned, it was in 2012 that Xi Jinping used this, they say, 新型大国关系, a new model of major power relations. And there have been various English translations of this, all of which are too long and a little bit hard to say. They don't roll trippingly off the tongue. But the idea that Xi was proposing, that the Chinese side was proposing, was that the United States and China had to find a way to work together to avoid what's become called the Thucydides trap, this notion that a rising power necessarily will challenge a status quo power, China challenging the United States, such that conflict would break out. And so that's the origin of this, is a determination on both sides to avoid conflict, a recognition that that has to be foundational to the relationship going forward. And so this was a phrase, not a theory, not a program, that the Chinese side put out, I think primarily to express that very simple but very important idea that America could accede to. And later in 2013, when Xi Jinping and President Obama met in Sunnylands, President Obama repeated this phrase.
So, do you think that this Thucydides trap or this conflict between these rising powers, is this inevitable, or do you just think that this is a fear?
It's certainly not inevitable. It is not just a fear. The fear is well-founded both historically, and if we look at the course of U.S.-China relations over the past year, if anything, there is more cause for concern. Let's leave fear as perhaps too emotional a term. But strong concern on the part of the United States and China that we may be headed for conflict, particularly in the Western Pacific, within what China calls the first island chain that runs from Japan all the way down to the Philippines and to the littoral states to Malaysia and Indonesia.
So this was introduced in 2012, and then in Sunnylands, June 2013, President Obama kind of reiterated this phrase.
He used it. Now, the Chinese side then ran with it, saying that the two nations' leaders had agreed that they would develop a new type of major power relationship at Sunnylands. And that was true. The question is, what did the two leaders mean by that? And from that time onward, every time Xi Jinping or any major Chinese figure speaks about U.S.-China relations, they repeat new model of major power relations as though it were a mantra and as though its meanings were clear and established, and they're not. The United States, on the other hand, has deliberately avoided this phrase. President Obama doesn't use it. He'll say, we need a new model of relations, we are two great powers. He talks around it, but he doesn't exactly use the phrase. Neither does Secretary Kerry, neither does Secretary Hagel. When then Senator, now Ambassador to China, Max Baucus, had his confirmation hearings in the Senate, he said we should be wary of this phrase. We should be careful. Senators Menendez, McCain, and Rubio all cast aspersions on it. So we have very different understandings of the content of this phrase, what it means. And I think the United States and China, as a cultural matter, have different attitudes toward the use of this phrase. America, we generally speaking, we don't christen our relations. They don't have names. We speak of the special relationship with Great Britain. But that was a description of a relationship after it was formed. It was not a prescription beforehand. China, in Chinese fashion, and I'm not blaming them for this, is using this phrase regularly and would like to form a program, specific goals, things that we will do and not do together, and have us march together under that banner. That's not going to happen. They seem not to be noticing that the American side is not using this same phrase. And so a phrase that initially brought Presidents Obama and Communist Party General Secretary Xi together at Sunnylands, in some ways it's now the use of this phrase and the non-use are dividing the two countries.
So perhaps it definitely means different things to the different countries. What do you think it means to the Chinese? Why have they kind of latched on to this phrase?
I'll give you a very American interpretation of this, which for the most part I share. The baseline is, as I said, a determination not to go to war. And of course that's very, very positive, and of course we sign on to that. Getting down to more detail, but there isn't very much detail, the Chinese said that it has three components. No conflict, no confrontation. Well, we have confrontations multiplying since the Sunnylands meeting, so that doesn't seem to be going very well. Mutual respect, 互相尊重 in Chinese. Well, what does that mean? We have starkly different interpretations of that. It would appear, China has not said this is an interpretation, that mutual respect means respect for core interests. We cannot call out or disagree with China on whatever it wants to identify as its core interests. The problem with that is that there are places where our core interests conflict with each other, most notably in the Western Pacific, which China is increasingly treating as something between a zone of deference and a territorial sea, and where America has core interests in freedom of navigation and in upholding international norms and refining the existing security structure in which America plays a major role. But Americans, too, they hear this phrase, 尊重 in Chinese, and those of us who've worked with China a lot tend to bristle at that. And I've been at meetings with Americans in which they've raised two doubts about that. Some Americans hear mutual respect as shut up. No criticism of China is licit. All criticism is a sign of disrespect. And of course, as Americans, we're constitutionally incapable of shutting up, and nor should we shut up. So that's one of the things that Americans hear. That Chinese would say, no, that's not what we intend, but Americans suspect that that's what this is about. And then the third component in the Chinese formula: no conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect. And the other is always seeking win-win situations. Well, of course, this is easy to say, and it's very nice when you can achieve that. We would like that too. But there are many cases in which that can't happen. And both sides see the other as not really upholding those implicit promises. They're always implicit, never explicit. America sees China being increasingly assertive and trying to establish new facts on the ground, whether it's in the East China Sea or the South China Sea. We see an expansionist China that we are not sure has an interest in according with international norms. And China sees a United States that is strengthening alliances and provoking regional players to oppose China's legitimate expansion. And so this phrase, new model of major power relations, which was initially, I think, positive but of very limited utility, is now sometimes used to paper over these very real and growing potential points of conflict.
So it sounds like we have a lot of these phrases that we use in U.S.-China relations, mutual respect, and then again, this great power relations. It sounds like perhaps this phrase is just a symptom of this inability to have maybe more strategic, real dialogue.
Well, it is real dialogue that we need. It's mostly this conducting relationships in accordance with these phrases. This is mostly a Chinese impulse. America's been guilty of it too. During the Bush administration, we spoke about China as a responsible stakeholder. And this was our phrase: America welcomes China's rise as a responsible stakeholder. This was, I think, always a problematic formulation because the Chinese heard it as condescending. Responsible stakeholder, that includes an implicit accusation that you're irresponsible, and it also says to China, we welcome your emergence on the world stage, your growing wealth, your growing power, as long as you play by the existing rules, namely, from the Chinese point of view, our rules, rules you didn't have a role in forming. That's the measure of responsibility. So that was inherently condescending. Earlier in the Clinton-Jiang Zemin era, I think we spoke of a constructive strategic partnership for the 21st century. Again, a mouthful that expressed a common, vague good wish and then died. My own recommendation would be that we scrap all of these formulations. They're not helpful. We have U.S.-China relations, 中美关系, a perfectly serviceable, all-inclusive phrase that both sides can accede to. The relationship is complex. It's going to remain. It's going to get even more complex. It is quite perilous, and we are figuring it out as we go along. Neither side is going to come up with a phrase which captures all of this complexity and which is also a program under which we can carry out U.S.-China relations. That's not the way it works. So I would say scrap it. There's a political problem with that on the Chinese side, which is that Xi Jinping repeats it regularly. So this is now part of his leadership brand, part of his strongman brand. And it's been repeated so often, as has his China Dream or Great Revitalization of the Chinese Nation, his phrases that are more aimed at a domestic audience, that he can't simply back off of this phrase without looking like a loss for him. Of course, that's not our problem, but we don't want him to lose face or get angry unnecessarily, but at the end of the day, it's really not our problem. I would recommend to the Chinese, not that they call me and ask, that they phase this out and just use the phrase U.S.-China relations, and that we talk about the many real issues that we have in greater specificity, rather than slinging these phrases about. Because they'll think that we've been dealing in bad faith. The fact that they use it, it's important to them, we don't. I'm afraid they'll think that we've dealt in bad faith and that it will actually end up hurting the relationship.
Well, so we're about a year away from Sunnylands. That happened about a year ago.
Right.
Surely by now the Chinese have noticed that we don't really use this phrase. So when you say you fear that they're going to see it in bad faith, do you think that's already happening? Or do you think...
Yes, I suspect. I haven't heard them say that, but my sense from meetings with Chinese is that it is. And of course, he's using this now primarily for domestic consumption. Most of Chinese moves, as most American foreign policy moves, there's always an eye toward the domestic audience. And in this case, it's certainly there. Right now, the Chinese continue to say it, not necessarily because they believe in it any more than we do, but just because they said it yesterday and last week and last month, and it's become part of their brand. But I think that our silence is going to get louder and louder. This is not the biggest problem in U.S.-China relations by any means. But when we're speaking a different vocabulary, when our basic starting point is different, it makes it hard to have the kind of discussions we need.
What about the consideration that these kinds of phrases are very kind of a traditional Chinese mentality? You know, Chairman Mao had these phrases for the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, Deng Xiaoping used these phrases. And so what about on our side as Americans, maybe being a little more, aware or perhaps considerate that this is maybe just the way the Chinese operate?
Well, but that's fine when they are talking to themselves. I think that if we could wind back the clock, was there a way for President Obama to be as friendly and as welcoming at Sunnylands as he was and should have been? I don't mean to say that the Sunnylands impulse was wrong, without giving the sense, which he did, that we were somehow jointly christening this phrase. And again, I don't want to overplay the importance of this, but it becomes a tiresome obstacle in our many ongoing, important, high-level dialogues with the Chinese side, because now when they haul out this language, you sort of can see the Americans all rolling their eyes. Here we go again. It's not constructive anymore. It played its role. It helped draw attention to this Thucydides trap, security's dilemma, to the realization that we must not fight. It's played its role. Let's say thank you and let it exit stage left and just recover U.S.-China relations. I think a more natural language, easier to say, less fraught term to describe the relationship.
And how do you think a Chinese diplomat or official would respond to the suggestion that we just scrap the phrase?
It's up to Xi Jinping uses it. And that, to date, is what matters. As long as Xi is using it, they have to use it in the various sub-dialogues. For example, recently when the Chinese chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff came here at the invitation of our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Martin Dempsey, he said, in accordance with the new model of major power relations, we must have a new model of mill-mill relations. So in the sub-dialogues, you get echoes of this as well, which the American side doesn't really reciprocate. We speak about the importance of the relationship, to be sure, but we tend to want to operationalize it and to get specific.
Kind of backtracking a little bit, we touched on this briefly, but does the United States really ever use these kinds of phrases, except for we talked about with Great Britain?
And even there, it's the special relationship. That's not part of our policy. That's just a name that's used in the press and popular parlance. There's no program that comes with it. We don't say, well, now if we're going to do this or the other thing vis-a-vis Great Britain, does this accord with the special relationship? That's not the way we function. That's not our style. And so I think it's probably best that we not reach for an alternate phrase to describe U.S.-China relations. We just need to keep it simple and have frank dialogues.
And so we talked about, because Xi Jinping does continually use it, it's very important to the Chinese. Is that just because they want to have this phrase to describe their emergence onto the global scale? Like, why is it so significant?
Well, as you earlier suggested, the Chinese Communist Party has always had its biaoyu, its phrases. Hu Jintao had harmonious society. Before that, we had scientific governance. We had the three represents. There are always, governance by slogan has been a hallmark of the Chinese Communist Party's rule in China. Again, that's their business. It's not part of the American style. I would therefore not even pretend. There's no need for us to give face to the Chinese on this point any more than they need to give face to us in speaking about human rights or democracy or anything else, things that matter to us. We shouldn't gratuitously insult them either. But I would just hope that the phrase would fade.
And so what would be your suggestion for fading out this phrase? Obviously we can't control, though the Chinese side does.
I would just use, in all of our discussions, I would just use U.S.-China relations. Don't dance around it. We say, great power relations, U.S.-China relations, we need a new model. Of course we're both great powers. Of course we need a new model. All of these things are true. I wouldn't even dance around their phraseology. I would just go with the default of U.S.-China relations and then speaking plainly about what it is we want to achieve.
And hoping that the Chinese side will take the hint and fade out the phrase on their own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There'd be no reason to be explicit about it.
So if we can go a little bit back to the origins of this phrase, we say this is, a great power relations, and when it was originally, initiated, perhaps it was this idea that we don't want to go to war with each other. And is that based on the idea that great powers just don't go to war with each other?
Well, no. It's the original fear was that a rising great power and a status quo great power often do go to war with each other. There's another issue with this phrase, which in Chinese is 大国, big country. Who's a great power? Do great powers in their relationships or in their international behavior, to what degree do they have special prerogatives, and to what degree are they supposed to accord with the same norms and international rules that apply to everybody else? Chinese also speak of small powers, and they speak of them often in a derogatory fashion, so that when, for example, not only popular protests, but Communist Party-controlled press and even leaders speak of Japan, you often hear 小日本, small Japan, implying, again, diminutive, stunted Japan. You hear it also in now Chinese rhetoric about Vietnam, 小越南. So the Chinese seem to have a belief in a 大国主义, this big countryism, special prerogatives that transcend international norms, international laws. Is this something that we want to be party to? This whole 大国, big country idea that it really isn't defined, but it's become clear through Chinese actions over the past year that as a big country, it would seem that their belief is that they do not have to accord with international norms. Now, they would also say, and fairly, that the United States by no means has always honored the norms that we now claim to be the primary upholders of, and that it's the United States that set the model for a big power which sets norms that others follow while it does what it would like to do. So there's an issue. There is an issue there. But there's no advantage in buying into this idea of 大国 or big country that seems important to Chinese diplomacy.
And this idea of 大国, it's kind of almost like a self-christened phrase as well.
Sure.
大国.
And to be fair, we're big on self-christening as well. The world's only indispensable nation. Aren't we swell? So it's no question about where they get this stuff. I mean, we love to sermonize ourselves about American exceptionalism, and the Chinese do the same.
Is perhaps one of the reasons that President Xi Jinping uses this phrase so much, along with, the Chinese dream, the revitalization, does it tie back into his need to maintain party and populist legitimacy?
Sure. I mean, the economic development, continued economic development in a more stable model and increasingly a more even development is the top priority of the Communist Party. And I think that by and large, most Chinese buy into that. There's one of China's great strengths is that they know what their national project is. I'm not sure the United States has a national project anymore, that we know what that is. Secondary to that development project is increasing China's influence, its power, its strength, its reputation internationally. And the China dream comprises both the domestic and the international. The revitalization, primarily domestic, but also international. And the new type of major power relations obviously is tied primarily to its international goals of increasing its influence. And in seeking to do that, the major obstacle it sees, no matter what direction it looks in, is the United States. My Chinese friends say everywhere we look, we see the shadow of the United States. And so China is trying to find some space in which to grow. This is an effort, among other things, to create that space.
And so how has this, just in your personal interactions with Chinese, even just non-government affiliated Chinese, have you seen that the usage of this phrase has changed the way they think about the United States? Because it's not necessarily a negative phrase. It's not like Xi Jinping's encouraging negative sentiment.
No, it is certainly not doing that. But it raises the expectations. If in fact it means that the United States as a fellow 大国 should be a full partner, these are full and equal partners, who will not challenge any of each other's self-identified core interests and which will respect each other, namely not say anything objectionable, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen all the time. Again, we're not looking to gratuitously insult China, and we're not seeking conflict, but we do have areas in which our interests overlap, and U.S.-China relations in economic terms, relations between institutions, academic organizations, NGOs, in many ways are stronger than ever, broader and deeper. But there are also very important areas in which our core interests, as of right now, are in conflict. Each country thinks the other is primarily to blame, and we're waiting for each other to change. So this phrase and Xi's constant use of it raises the bar of expectations, which can mean, among other things, that when America is seen by Chinese as not meeting those expectations, that the response against the United States is even stronger than it would otherwise have been.
That's very interesting. And so that kind of is in conflict with the Chinese mentality of, a harmonious society, harmonious
From the
relations.
Chinese point of view, it is we who are not being harmonious. The Chinese would argue that they are entirely consistent, that China is and always has been a peaceful, harmonious country, and that this is obvious to everybody. The problem with that is that it's not true. It's very far from obvious to everybody. It's not obvious to China's closest neighbors, who are very worried about China's growing assertiveness, even though they very much want good relations with China. They don't want to have to pick sides between the United States and China. They have concerns about the United States' power as well. But their concerns over the past several years about China, it appears, have been stronger in most cases than their concerns about the United States. So Chinese would say that all of these goals, all of these phrases, all of these descriptions of themselves are perfectly consistent.
Right.
And that it's other nations and the United States that are behaving in ways that challenge a peaceful status quo.
And so what do you think a country like Vietnam or the Philippines or even Japan, their response to this phrase, great power relations, is? Do you think there's eye rolling on their part, or do you think it's concern?
There are concerns of several kinds. There was earlier, there was certainly strong concern in Japan, and this continues to this day, that the United States and China were somehow going to walk off into the sunset hand in hand, and Japan would be left behind. That is clearly not the case. This is not a G2. It is not a U.S.-China condominium. Nobody is interested in that. And the United States and China, since this phrase was first floated, certainly since a year ago, the potential sources of conflict have increased, and the United States and Japan have drawn closer together. And the Philippines and Vietnam, like most of the other countries in the area, would like to balance the United States and China and derive benefits from both of those relationships and not have either dominate. It would appear as of today that while they want good relations with China and certainly want a good economic relationship with China, their concerns about China's strategic intention and its intentions to dominate and to have a zone of deference in the East Asia Pacific, that those concerns are on the rise, and that they are less concerned about American hegemony.
Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have today, but I again just wanted to thank you, Mr. Daly, for joining us and helping us learn a little bit more about the origins, the significance, the complications that come with this phrase. And to all of you joining me from home, I'll see you next time on China Forum.